Biltmore House is the largest house ever in the United States, ever. And nothing has surpassed it, ever. When a lot of people think about what is the largest house in America, they think the White House, or they think some sort of mansion or cottage, as they called them in Newport, or they think about Hearst in California. But Biltmore House dwarfs them many, many, many times over.
So welcome back to another episode of Our Podcast. Today's guest is Denise Kiernan, who is author, journalist, producer, and host of Craft, Authors in Conversation. Denise is also the author of the book The Last Castle, the epic story of love, loss, and American royalty in the nation's largest home, which is the story of the Biltmore and the largest house in all of the Americas. This is today's topic on our podcast, so thank you so much, Denise, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So outside of North Carolina and maybe some of the East Coast, I don't think many people have heard of the Biltmore. And just to give people a little bit of an idea, the Biltmore opened on Christmas Eve in 1895 to family and friends. The mansion is 250 rooms that spans 175,000 square feet, has 35 family and guest bedrooms, 66 servant bedrooms, 65 fireplaces, and 125,000 acres of mountain property with landscape gardens, a deer park, agricultural fields, and a professionally managed forest. And this house, keep in mind, was built in the late 1890s, also had a heated indoor swimming pool that held 70,000 gallons of water, and had 2 elevators. For comparison, the White House is 55,000 square feet with 132 rooms. Denise, how would you introduce and describe the Biltmore to someone who's never visited the estate?
That's a great question, because one of the things that inspired me to write about the house, and I do live here in Asheville, North Carolina, where Biltmore House is located, but I usually don't like to write about anything that is close to home. I like to go further afield and be in foreign territory, because I feel as though different receptors are turned on when I'm not comfortable. But I've always been fascinated with that space and the fact that Biltmore House is the largest house ever in the United States, ever. And nothing has surpassed it, ever. When a lot of people think about what is the largest house in America, they think the White House, or they think some sort of mansion or cottage, as they called them in Newport, or they think about Hearst in California. But Biltmore House dwarfs them many, many, many times over. And you mentioned the 175,000 square foot number, which is perfect, but that doesn't even include the stables and the lodging that were above the stables, and the conservatory, and all of the other structures that were on the property. And so initially I just was really fascinated by this place, and it's beautiful, and I loved going there, and it intrigued me. But I had a couple of friends. We moved here from New York City, as a lot of people in Asheville did. And I had 2 different sets of friends visit me one summer. And both were avid readers. One was a professor, the other was a theater guy. I took them to Biltmore, because that's what you do when you live here. Both of them said, "This is really the biggest house in America?" I'm like, "Yep." They said, "But there was something bigger." No, there wasn't anything bigger. And why don't I know more about it? They both asked that same question. But the linchpin was, I don't know if you saw this, there was a documentary called The Queen of Versailles. I don't know if some people saw it, some people didn't. It was about a family. It was in the 21st century. And this guy was going to build what he said was the largest house in America. And it was going to have gold toilets, and it was going to have fountains and this, that, and the other thing, and blah, blah, blah. And they let a documentary crew film all the steps of this process. It's a fascinating thing to watch. And what's most fascinating is they didn't ever finish it. If it had been finished, it still would have only been 90-some thousand square feet, which is huge, but it's about half the size of what Biltmore is. And I was looking when this came out because I was already thinking about this story, and all of these places online are talking about this is going to be the biggest house in America. This is going to be the biggest house in America. And I'm thinking, yeah, no, it's not. And so I thought there is something to be said about this place. But it wasn't just about the structure. It was about the people who were in it and the effect they had on the community.
Yeah, I never saw that documentary. I was reading an article, if I remember right, was it like a guy who owned a timeshare company? And then it was, I think it was around,
yeah,
they started it before the '08 recession, and then they basically had to liquidate everything. And then they, right, which is pretty much how it goes, I guess. To kind of give us some backstory here, who built the Vanderbilt? Who built the Biltmore? It was, George.
It's funny when you say the Vanderbilt, because actually people who were already living in Asheville at the time, there are some newspaper articles I cite in the book where some local citizens said, could he have been more egocentric, built more? Could he have called it Vanderhouse or something else? So George Vanderbilt was one of the sons of William Henry Vanderbilt. And William Henry Vanderbilt was the son of what everyone called the Commodore, Cornelius Vanderbilt, who was a founder of the Vanderbilt fortune. To many of us in the 21st century, the Vanderbilts seem like really, really old American New York money, but they actually weren't at the time. Cornelius, the founder of the family fortune, started off working on a farm with not much of anything and got a little rowboat and started ferrying people from the family farm on Staten Island over to Manhattan. And through his dealings and his kind of, chutzpah, he built that into a rail and shipping empire. When he died, he was extremely wealthy. He left the bulk of his fortune to William Henry Vanderbilt, who was not his chosen or favorite son until late in his life. And William Henry more than doubled what he was left. This made the Vanderbilts one of the most wealthy families on the planet, but they were considered to many in New York as still new money. And William Henry, his kids, he had many kids, and George was one of them. George lived at the family house on Fifth Avenue well into his bachelorhood. It was a beautiful home with amazing art collection, which George grew up with a great fondness of art. He spent his time going to the opera, going to concerts, this, that, and the other thing. And he didn't necessarily seem like someone who was that interested in getting married, but he was going to have a country house, as most established families of the time did. But most of the wealthy families had their country houses in Newport, Rhode Island, or elsewhere in the Northeast. And Newport, they have, if you've ever gone to Newport or do any of those tours, you do the tour of the cottages. I don't know, I've never actually looked, but the etymology of the word cottage, I don't know how that came to be associated with the houses that were in Newport, which were, 50,000 feet, 60,000 feet, these gigantic, ornate, gilt palaces. But George built his in Asheville. And that in and of itself was a really fascinating choice, and one that completely transformed this entire region of Western North Carolina.
Asheville, North Carolina averages about 10 million visitors a year. And I believe last year, 1.6 million people visited the Biltmore, well over 10%. So what has Biltmore meant for Asheville, and how has it changed the community? And not just Asheville, but also Western North Carolina, the Pigshaw National Forest, etc.
Well,
Or Pisgah National Forest.
Pisgah.
Pisgah.
It's like it's a Z, but it's not. Yeah, Pisgah, yeah. You know, to talk about the transformation, you really do have to go back to the early days of George Vanderbilt, William Henry's son, deciding to have his country house here. So that was already a strange decision. But George was very close to his mother. At the time, in the 18th century, Asheville was already a destination for rich folks in Charleston, South Carolina, who wanted to get away from the heat. And they would come up to the mountains in Western North Carolina. And it was also believed at the time that mountain air could cure things like tuberculosis. So there was like a cottage industry of physicians that set up shop here. And people came from New York, other places, to be treated because the mountain air was curative. A lot of their treatment, they would sit on what they called breathing porches, which is, guess what? You sit on a porch and you breathe. And people made money off of this, which I find fascinating. And George and his mother came down. She was going to see one of these physicians. And George went out on horseback and was investigating the area. And he really fell in love with the beauty of the southern Appalachian landscape and what he could see. And he thought, I think I would want to stay here. And that's how he ended up arriving here. It wasn't unusual for someone from New York City to come here, but his mother was a big impetus. And then once he got here, he just loved what he saw. And then he started looking at buying up land. And certainly it was at a pretty affordable price at the time. And him being here at that time even started to transform the economy of the town. He ended up actually building housing for his workers, creating a rail spur from an established rail station to go out to the site where he wanted to build the house. And everything that comes along with bringing that many workers and that much infrastructure into a community. But one of the things he also did was be in touch with Frederick Law Olmsted, who did the landscaping, father of landscape architecture, and a forester named Carl Schenck. And so these guys were looking at the surrounding areas. And at the height of George's holdings, he had about 125,000 acres, which was more than Washington, D.C., the entire area at the time. But a lot of it had already been kind of denuded by loggers and people who had come through and were wanting to just, take everything the mountains and that landscape had to offer. And so the forestry program that Biltmore established became about trying to preserve what was good and rebuild what had been damaged. And one of the things I find so fascinating about the entire life of Biltmore and the Vanderbilts in Western North Carolina is that they had such an incredible impact on the natural landscape here and the natural history here.
How many workers did he have at the height? And us?
No idea.
Because they had train tracks.
Oh,
they had the limestone from Indiana they were bringing in. And
yes, exactly.
It was a massive operation.
It's more massive than most things we can conceive of today. The nearest little town, this was right south of Asheville. Now it's basically, it abuts Asheville, was a little town called Best. And that had a little train station. And George was William Henry's son, who was the son of Cornelius Vanderbilt. And the Vanderbilts were a shipping and train or railroad empire. These are the folks who brought us Grand Central Station in New York City. So George knew he needed to get supplies and workers out to his work site. So he just built a rail spur that went from the existing station out to where everything was being built. And where that station was around there, he had a bunch of housing built. And eventually that little town that was best became Biltmore Village, Biltmore. He was bringing in masons and materials and all of this stuff. So anything coming, like you mentioned, the limestone from Indiana, all these other supplies and all of these other workers, they were coming in via this rail line to the site where Biltmore House was being constructed. And even that early on had already transformed that aspect of the area, because he basically took one town best and transformed it into something else via his family access to the ability to create rail spurs. And it was very important for him to be able to transport workers from distant locations and materials like the limestone from Indiana out to the site where he was constructing. It's a phenomenally massive operation, one that I don't think could be reproduced today. I don't know.
They estimate it cost $5 million to build that house in 1895.
I was going to say, 19th century dollars.
Right. In 19th century dollars, I Googled it, and it said that $5 million today would be worth about $150 million. But then I'm thinking, like, you there's no way in hell you could build that house today for $150 million. And that doesn't even include the fact that at the time it had 128,000 acres of property.
That's exactly what you're saying is one of the things that really intrigued me, because when this guy in Florida was talking about building the largest house in America and all this money they were spending, I was thinking, that's nothing, compared to what was spent in the late 19th century on this house.
Throughout your book, The Last Castle, you vividly describe the opulent parties and social gatherings hosted at the Biltmore House. Can you share any specific anecdotes that exemplify the grandeur and extravagance of these events in the Gilded Age?
What was interesting to me is that they paled in comparison to what was going on Fifth Avenue in New York City by George's, brothers, sisters-in-law, all of those folks. They were having galas that journalists would come in from all over just to report on what was going on. George's gatherings were elaborate, but a little more subdued than what his family was doing in New York City. And I think a lot of that was because of his wife, Edith, who was one of the inspirations for me wanting to actually write a book about this space, because it's always hard to think, like, why do I want to write a book about this? Hasn't this been done? Should it just be a magazine article? But Edith and her role, to me, is one of the things that really inspired me. But, I mean, parties at the time, his sister-in-law had a costume ball where people were coming in electrified outfits because electricity was a new thing, coming with not dead, but actual cattails on their body because of a costume they were wearing, coming as kings and queens and princes, etc., from places in France. These were massive, massive, massive balls. And George usually at Biltmore would have somewhat tamer events involving his family and close friends, but the number of turkeys that might be slaughtered, the number of eggs that would be needed. The kitchen alone at that place is bigger than, in the basement, the servants' kitchen downstairs at Biltmore is bigger than most houses any of us have ever seen. So when people came to visit, because this was a country house, not his primary house, when people came to visit, they wanted to be able to entertain them in the best possible fashion. And that involved an awful lot of food and transportation, often from New York down to the house, and parties outside, picnics, horseback riding, all of that sort of stuff. If you wanted to visit someone in the country, you wanted to go visit Biltmore House. It was also so different from everything that was normal at that time. I mean, I love movies that talk about the Gilded Age and television. I loved Downton Abbey. I often call Biltmore, Appalachian Abbey. That whole way of living is so fascinating. And he was from that world, but he departed it in a way because he sort of broke with tradition. Nobody had their country house in the sticks in Western North Carolina. No one. He was the only one. There's nothing else down here as far as I know. But it's almost as though he wanted privacy or to break from family tradition, which was a heavy tradition. The Vanderbilts, by the time he was born, they were a big deal. And it's sort of like he wanted to do his own thing in a way.
In your book, you quote a traveling companion of George Vanderbilt. I believe it was his friend Field. And in his letters, he wrote, "I do not for a moment envy the position of George Vanderbilt. He is not one speck as happy as I am, and the spending of money gives him absolutely no thrill. Half the pleasure in life comes from learning to choose between things." End of quote.
That's one of my favorite quotes.
I really enjoyed that passage from the book. I mean, what are the disadvantages of extreme wealth, especially when that wealth is inherited?
That's a great question, and one I think that's actually still applicable today, which is one of the things I love about history, right? History is a great blueprint for the choices we make in the present day. Willie Field was by no means poor, and his family was established, but the Vanderbilts were so in the stratosphere when it came to finances and influence. And Willie Field and George were so very close, and actually his archives were a huge, huge boon to me when I was writing this book, because the funny thing about research is when you're doing very, very old research is, say you and I were to write each other letters. If I died, my letters, my writing, my thoughts would be in your archives, not mine. So George used to write Willie all the time, and Willie used to write his mother all the time. And the Field archives are in the New York Public Library Manuscript and Archives Division. And he talked about things like what you mentioned, and he saw George kind of struggling with what to do, the burden of having decided to build a house that grand, and also wanting to go to India, wanting to do all of this traveling, which was interpreted by people, and who knows, because unless you actually had a conversation with George or saw something he wrote, was interpreted at the time and in the future as sort of boredom with having created this giant albatross of sorts in Western North Carolina, where he was essentially alone unless a bunch of people came to visit. That's a lot of space to fill with visitors. So I think the burden Field was talking about was, I don't know, and all of this is conjecture, trying to compete with your brothers, trying to make a name for yourself in society, which he didn't seem completely obsessed with doing, but yet he built this giant place. But he was also very enamored of art and architecture, and that meant a lot to him. But I don't think he realized, and again, this is my assumption, this is not something I can say he said this, I don't think he realized how distant, how removed from his regular life he would be, how removed from the society, whether or not he liked it, that was incredibly familiar to him, with which he grew up. And so I think Field was kind of tapping into that mood that George would sometimes exhibit of, wow, I have this big place and it's not necessarily giving me what I thought. And it's a little bit of a burden, not only financially, but also socially, emotionally. But again, that's me interpreting what Field said. But you're right, it's a big responsibility to have something like that and have it be so remote and so far away from your family and so far away from the social folks. You always want, as a writer, a researcher who does nonfiction, you always want to find that one letter, that one diary entry that says, I wish I had / hadn't whatever built more or done this or that because, or, I wish I blah, blah, blah. And sometimes you find stuff like that, but most of the time you don't. But Field knew him better than very many. And I think he was really attuned to George's vacillations regarding his desire to have this enormous, remarkable house in a very remote place that dwarfed everything his older brothers did in Newport. Not even close.
How long of a train ride was that in the, say, 1900 from New York City to Biltmore?
I don't know, but they had these. They had their own. This thing, like, because they came from a rail and shipping magnate, they had private train cars. Riding on those train cars was basically like the most opulent hotel room you can imagine, with servants and food. And it was attached to the end of another train. And then when you needed to get off, your car would be detached from the train with which you were traveling. Train travel for that strata of society back then was nutty, especially for the Vanderbilts, because they were the train line. They ran the trains. These were the folks that had control over most of the train lines in the Northeast and down the Eastern seaboards. I don't actually know exactly how long that would have taken, but it would have been a pleasant journey.
Yeah, that's the equivalent of flying private.
Oh yeah, exactly.
Private jet. And that's the equivalent.
Just go have a fun. Yeah. Exactly.
At their height, the Vanderbilt family was worth. They had more money than the U.S. Treasury, and in today's dollars, it'd be over $400 billion, which would make Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates seem a little bit.
Yeah. Cry and feel wimpy, yes.
Yeah. And if you look at any list of rich families that blew through their money, you always see the Vanderbilts on that list, even though to this day, the Biltmore is still privately owned by the family.
Yes, it is.
And you never really seem to hear that. Nope. So it is still privately owned. So they still do have some wealth. And I think, they still have plenty of money, but they did seem to burn through quite a bit, particularly George. I believe in your book you said that he inherited like $12 million from the Commodore, right? And then he spent $5 million on this house, and that doesn't even include the taxes and the upkeep, which had to be insane.
Well, the taxes, that's a great thing that you mentioned that, because he's building Biltmore House in the late 19th century, the 1880s. It's open to his family in 1895. 1913, the income tax laws change. And that changes everything for many, many wealthy families. Because prior to that, whatever money you had. That good for you, that's yours. And at that time in the early 20th century is when a lot of wealthy families in America, also in England, started to have to reckon with, well, we have these taxes to pay now. How are we going to maintain these giant estates? The people who worked there, the workers in these spaces, were expensive, which is why a lot of times George and Edith and their family would just go spend time in Europe, because to us now, going and spending a summer in Europe sounds super extravagant. Back then, going over to Europe was actually cheaper, and you could shut down all of the expenses related to maintaining your house. You didn't have to heat it, because he actually had heat in that house, which was a very big deal. You know, he had heat, he had people living there, cooking there, all that sort of stuff. And you could shut down your house, go to Europe, where it was less expensive, which seems strange to us, but it was. As the early 20th century progressed, all of this wealth that seemed just, unending, because honestly, the amount of money, getting $12, $13 million in the late 19th century, that's an unbelievable amount of money to get. And that's in addition to, I can go to my brother's house in Newport. There's still this family house at 640 Fifth Avenue. All of these other things that he had going for him. Not to say, oh, poor George. I mean, we'd all like to be in that situation. But yeah, things shifted a great deal, not just for him, but for a lot of people in the United States and overseas. But again, his situation was a really interesting way to look at that kind of the dying of the Gilded Age.
Yeah, we were kind of talking about he had the taxes, he spent this money on the house. In 1913, income tax, 1916, you had inheritance tax. And then by 1930, that's the first year they made the house public, so visitors could come to the house, pay a fee, and then tour the house. So it's like they were trying to find a way to pay off the expenses of this mega mansion.
You have those taxes that impacted severely people like George and others. Then George dies. Edith, his wife, Edith Stuyvesant Vanderbilt, amazing woman. She had been approached by many people to sell off various parts of the land and the house, which is what a lot of places did. And there are a lot of wonderful places in England, for example, that were incredible estates that either were knocked right to the ground or became shopping centers or something else. And that happened here too. Things were either completely eradicated or they were transformed into hotels or colleges or this, that, or the other. Biltmore House had this giant surrounding property, and the land around Biltmore House, the landscape, the views, that's one of the things that George Vanderbilt fell in love with. And Edith Stuyvesant Vanderbilt, when she married him and came down, she loved it too. And they didn't want that to go away. They had done so much work and invested so much in rehabilitating land that had been logged and all of that sort of stuff by bringing in foresters like Carl Schenck and Gifford Pinchot and doing all of these. The first forestry school in the United States was at Biltmore. I mean, this is something nobody thinks about. The house is great. All of that stuff is wonderful. The first forestry school in the United States was at Biltmore. And the preservation of 90 or so thousand acres of that land is the foundation of Pisgah National Forest. And Edith is a big part of making sure that that happened after George died. And this place I live, this place would be very, very different had she not done what she needed to do to make sure that that land stayed in the family, because this whole area would be condos. It would have been logged to the end of its life. People come here now still to this day for beer, as you said, but also to go kayaking, to go hiking, to drive the Blue Ridge Parkway, to go see waterfalls. All of that. This is called the land of waterfalls now. all of that stuff, that was on property that was Vanderbilt property, that Edith and George made sure that that land was preserved, rehabilitated, and after George was gone, Edith did what she could to make sure it stayed. She actually gave it over to the government to say this is going to be a national forest. And it's interesting because when we think about Biltmore House or the Vanderbilts in Western North Carolina, there's so much talk about what George built, right? Biggest house ever in America, this giant 175,000 square foot house with bowling alleys and a pool and the first private elevators and all of this sort of stuff. But actually, to me, what's most impactful and important and meaningful is what they didn't build and what they preserved, what they left, what they ensured would continue on in its natural state. And that's why this place is still quite so beautiful.
So George and Edith Vanderbilt were the couple, the husband and wife team that had this house funded and built. And then they had a baby, which was Cornelia. And then Cornelia was actually born in the house, which, to think one of the richest families in the world is having their first baby born in the woods of Asheville. I mean, granted, it's in a 175,000 square foot house, but still, I mean, you're pretty far from any amenities. And then she kind of grows up in this house, and then she marries a guy named John Cecil, who, kind of make a long story short, basically, they were married for 10 years. Cornelia and John Cecil got divorced, and then John stayed in the house. And from reading your book, it seems like of all the family members, he's actually the longest serving resident of that house. He was basically there from 1924 to 1954, minus a couple of years during World War II where he went back to England. Then to this day, even the Cecil name, maybe that's the reason a lot of people don't realize the Vanderbilts own it, is because she took his name, and the Cecil family, which is still, through marriage, is the Vanderbilt family. But then he's like this aristocrat from London, and then he would rather be a dairy farmer on the Biltmore farm than he would go back to England and be a aristocrat or whatever you would want to call it. But I found him to be maybe the most interesting character, real life person in the book.
Yeah, it's fascinating how, again, like, I thought it was interesting to use the house as a way to talk about how society changed between the Gilded Age and 20th century arts and craft age, whatever. And he's a very big part of that. And Cornelia being born in Biltmore House, she could have been born in New York City. They were up and back all the time. But they had her in Asheville. They had her here. And she was celebrated, and everybody was like, oh my God. There were poems written about her by local folks. And they raised her, which I thought was really interesting. They raised her in the community. So George and Edith had helped establish schools in Biltmore Village. It was called Biltmore Village by that time because Best, the city they originally arrived in, was no longer. She went to school with the children of folks who worked on the estate. She wasn't like at home, cloistered, only with tutors. She interacted with all of the kids who were a part of the larger community. Many of them who were from much humbler beginnings doesn't even begin to encapsulate how different her upbringing and her wealth was from the kids she went to school with. And I think that made her really interesting. She was a a child in two different worlds. She was born into extreme, unfathomable wealth at that time. And yet she was going to school with folks who were working on the property her family owned. And it made her a really, really big part of what Asheville was at that time. I think it really shaped her in a way. And then marrying Cecil, I think was, it got a ton of attention. The marriage was extremely celebrated. There were all sorts of dignitaries and folks who came to the marriage, which took place in Asheville. And once they split, he felt an attachment to this place. And again, it's one of those things as a writer of nonfiction, like if I were writing a novel, I could infuse the prose with what I think about why he was so enamored of this place and why he stayed. I don't know. I never saw a letter or anything that said, here is why I decided not to go back to England. But his commitment to Biltmore House, and for a long time, Edith was still there, it was quite impressive and made a difference. And then he got their two sons back here, and they had an attachment to the house as well. And, it's kind of, I don't know, luck, synchronicity. I don't know what that enabled them to say, you know what, we're just going to keep this place. We're going to keep it in the family. We're going to open it up to folks and see what happens. And it's so frustrating because as a writer, you wish you could just get in somebody's head and say, what were you thinking? Why did you do this? You had no money. You were having trouble. You're writing letters to people saying, how much are these that's in the book. How much are these tapestries worth? I mean, they were really trying to figure out how to keep things going. When they opened it to the public, the kids were in the 60s. The kids were like kids. They were adults by then. They were writing their own brochures. They were planting flowers on the grounds to make it more attractive. It's really remarkable it stayed in the family because a lot of these places became nonprofits, historic sites supported by grants and other things. And Biltmore is still privately owned.
I guess I mispronounced his name. You said it's Cecil, not Cecil. So I didn't say that.
That's just, it looks like Cecil to me too, but
I mean,
correct number of
times. Right, but they got divorced after 10 years. He seems like he's one of the most instrumental people for actually keeping it in the family. He's the one that, I believe he planted the first wines on the property. Now there's all these vineyards, and it's the biggest selling vineyard in all of the U.S. is actually at the Biltmore.
It is the most visited winery in the United States. So when you think of wineries in the United States, you think of, Napa Valley or, those wines in Oregon and Washington. Nope. The most visited winery in the United States is actually at Biltmore House. But that came later. But to me, because Edith refused to sell off the land, to me, she is the linchpin of why this house exists. They don't have 125,000 acres anymore, but I think I should check before I say this, but it's at least 8,000.
Yeah, they say 8,000.
Okay.
Yeah.
Not bad. Not terrible.
Not terrible. Yeah, I read that they own another 10,000, but it's not part of the state. The family owns another.
Yeah. And they do solar and they do biofuel. They do all of this stuff, a lot of which I think George and Edith would have appreciated. I don't know. Again, conjecture. I think they would have. I don't know.
Yeah, the Gilded Age witnessed a growing wealth gap, and the Vanderbilt family was at the forefront of the era's elite. In what ways did the Biltmore Estate become a symbol of the disparities between the leisure class and the service class in America?
Oh, I think they were very representational of that Gilded Age disparity, the Vanderbilts, the Astors, all of the Rockefellers as you move forward.
The Carnegies.
The Carnegies as you start to move into the early 20th century. Yeah, they were a massive representation of that disparity. And as the 20th century moved forward, that disparity wasn't admired as much. And the Industrial Revolution brought attention to other aspects of society and the role of the working class in society. And their roles started to dissipate in the way that it had kind of been born. And again, I feel as though Edith Vanderbilt could have been one of those people who said, yep, this isn't working for us anymore. Sell all of this off. I'm leaving. But she kind of stuck with the property and the forest and the land, which was fortuitous considering where George had decided to build this ridiculously large house, because up in Newport, they didn't have as many choices land-wise. In England, they certainly didn't. They were a reminder of how changing times impact the roles and lives and fortunes of all classes. And it was a very classist society in the 19th century. It got a little better as the 20th century dawned and taxes came into play and all of those things. But it's an interesting transformation between the late 19th century, early 20th century, and how these families adjusted or didn't, how they moved forward or didn't, legacies that they left, good or bad, or in between. And what I like about all of this is how does that inform or impact what we do today? Those of us who are fortunate, what do we do to leave something for future generations? And I'm not saying, oh, yay, rich Gilded Age people, but I do think that it would have been easier for Edith if she had just sold all of that land to loggers and everybody else who wanted it, so that she could just go back up to New York or honestly wherever she wanted and let it be. But she was committed to that property. And then her son-in-law, again, thought this is something worth preserving. And to me, that's really interesting. If you look around today at what we have or what we do, what is worth preserving? What do we feel invested in leaving to future generations? How are we going to be stewards for future generations? What is it we want to pass on to them, not just in dollars and cents, but in nature and culture and all of that sort of stuff? That idea of stewardship, I always find, and I don't have any answers, but that idea of stewardship always seems interesting to me. But that's what I love about history, is it makes you ask questions in the present, right? History makes you ask questions of the present, which is why I like it.
I'm always fascinated with the Gilded Age. I think it's one of the more interesting eras of at least recent history, if you're talking about the overall timeline of humanity. Right now in present day, 2023, a lot of people think that technology moves so fast and we're seeing AI, and of course we had the internet of the 90s. But in the Gilded Age, basically a 30-year span, we went from horse and buggy to the internal combustion engine car. You had no electricity. And then what did electricity bring? Air conditioners and refrigerators and running water and plumbing, because you could now move all this stuff around. The Gilded Age is sandwiched between the Reformation, which is basically the period right after the Civil War, and then the Progressive Era, which is when you had women's suffrage and the ability to vote, which would have been basically at the end of World War. And other people will call the Gilded Age the robber baron era, which is kind of pejorative for this era. Now in today's society, the vast majority of wealth that we have outside of a few tech companies, like 5 or 6 of them, is mostly through the financialization of our monetary system. But in the Gilded Age, these people were actually creating real things. Like the car, the air conditioner, the refrigerator, sanitation, the airplane, of course, in the early 1900s, the Wright brothers. To think like you could have been born right around the Civil War, riding a horse and buggy, and then in the early 1900s, especially if you're, say, a female in 1920, now you can vote. You're riding around in a motorized vehicle. You're flying around on a plane. I mean, like this was like what we think is moving fast. I mean, like this is a joke compared to this Gilded Age.
Oh, yeah. The Industrial Revolution, the transformation, late 1800s, early 1900s is spectacular and so fascinating. And it's one of the things that I love about having to dive into that era was just there's so much there. And when you start to think about it, it's like, oh, I should have put that in. I should have put that in. I should have talked about that. I mean, it was really a very rich, transformative moment in American history. It's one of my favorite periods of American history, for sure. No doubt. No question.
We had Matt Stoller on this show who wrote a book called Goliath, and I asked him about the Gilded Age robber baron era, and he said that era never existed. He says the true robber baron era is present day America. The inequality then compared to now, we're probably exceeding that.
Oh, I forget, I wish I could remember. I forget who published this. It was based on actual statistics that the income wealth disparity of the Gilded Age has never been equaled or exceeded until now. And we have blown through that.
I have 2 final questions for you.
Okay.
Where do people get a hold of you, find you, if you have any new books coming out?
Yeah.
And then secondly, what is your final thought? What was the inspiration behind the book? What do you want to leave the viewing and listening audience with?
Edith Vanderbilt was the inspiration for the book, The Last Castle. Biltmore House has always been associated with George Vanderbilt and his family. Edith was the woman who went into the community. She is the woman who could have sat back as the mistress of the largest house in America and just written checks to look good, like she was helping people. She got on horses and rode into the country to bring soup and blankets to workers who were sick, to the wives of workers who were having babies, helped establish schools. She, to me, was an example of what someone with incredible wealth and fortune can do for her community. She decided to be a part of her community. And if we all decided, no matter our wealth, to be a part of our community and help where we can, what would the world look like?
Where do people find you? Get a hold of people?
Yes, me. Okay. Denise.
Yourself.
Yes. Whatever. DeniseKiernan.com. is the best way to find about me. And my most recent books are actually about the history of Thanksgiving in America, which is not what most of us grew up with. But it's sort of a look at, I would consider it a biography of gratitude. And that book is called We Gather Together. But if you go to my website, DeniseKiernan.com, I'd appreciate it. That'd be nice. Yeah.
So
go if you want to. I don't know.
What's the quick summary of the book on Thanksgiving? Like what is not, you said it's different than what people think.
So the history of Thanksgiving as a national holiday in America is thanks to a widowed mother of 5 with no formal education who became one of the most powerful editors in the United States of America in the 1800s. And she thought that Thanksgiving, there were many Thanksgivings before the Thanksgiving we know. In Europe, before North America, she wanted it to be one day every year, the same day throughout the country, so everybody could say thank you on the same day. And her ability to rise up from not a ton of money and no education and just take control of where she found herself and just be someone who spoke up for something that mattered to her and petition presidents and ambassadors, etc., for a national day of thanks that would occur on the same day every year. Sarah Josepha Hale is the reason we have that. And my book is We Gather Together. And it is about the true factual story of how Thanksgiving became a holiday. And I actually have I have a young reader's edition, and I have a children's picture book called Giving Thanks. So it's what we call a family read. So an entire family of different ages and reading levels can talk about the importance of gratitude and how we can give thanks every year together.
Thank you so much, Denise Kiernan, for joining us, the author of the book, The Last Castle, the epic story of love, loss, and American royalty in the nation's largest home. Thank you so much, Denise. I really enjoy you taking the time to join us. And
thank you.
It's just such a fascinating story. I just enjoyed the book so much. And there's so much that goes into building the largest house in America, and the years, the death, the loss. It was just an engaging story.
Thank you so much.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.